Every Sunday morning, without fail, billionaire Richard Halstead made the same quiet drive to the same grave because 5 years of grief had never loosened its grip on him. He thought he knew everything about the night his 12-year-old son died. Then, one cold October morning, he arrived to find two small girls already kneeling there, twins in worn coats, praying at a headstone belonging to a boy they had never once met. What they whispered to that grave would pull Richard into a truth so long buried it would bring him to his knees. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The cemetery was the one place on earth where Richard Halstead stopped pretending. Every other corner of his life was performance. The press conferences where he announced billion-dollar acquisitions. The boardroom where subordinates watched his face for permission to breathe. The charity galas where he smiled for cameras and said the right things to the right people. All of it was armor. All of it was rehearsed. But Riverside Memorial Cemetery on a Sunday morning was his. Just him and the silence and the weight of everything he couldn't fix. He had made this trip every Sunday for 5 years without exception. Not once had he sent a representative or called ahead. He drove himself in a plain dark sedan, no driver, no security detail trailing 3 cars behind. He wore a coat like any other man. He carried no flowers most days because flowers felt like decoration, and grief wasn't something you decorated. He always arrived early, before the groundskeepers finished their rounds, when the morning mist still clung to the older headstones and the whole place smelled of wet grass and earth. He would walk the same path through the iron gates, past the old oak on the left, along the gravel lane, and then turn right at the stone angel with the chipped wing. Daniel's grave was in the quieter section, away from the main road. Richard had chosen the spot deliberately. His son had never been a loud boy. Daniel had been thoughtful and observant, the kind of child who noticed a bird with an injured wing or a classmate eating lunch alone. A quiet corner of the world suited him. The headstone was simple gray granite. Richard had rejected the elaborate monuments his advisor suggested. There was only Daniel's name, the years of his too short life, and a single line beneath. He always had time for others. Richard would stand there for 20 or 30 minutes, sometimes longer depending on his mood. He didn't pray. He wasn't sure what he believed anymore, not since the night a police officer showed up at his door with a face full of carefully arranged sympathy. He just stood. He remembered. He carried the weight of the years Daniel never got to have and tried not to collapse under it. On this particular morning in early October, the autumn had arrived overnight with conviction. The trees along the cemetery path had turned deep amber and rust, and a few stubborn leaves still clung to branches while others scattered across the gravel in small gusts. Richard pulled his coat tighter and walked his familiar route. He turned right at the stone angel and stopped. 2 small girls were kneeling at Daniel's grave. He stood perfectly still for a moment, certain he was misreading the scene. People occasionally drifted to the wrong headstone by accident, especially in the older sections where the markers were crowded close together. He expected them to stand up, look around in confusion, and move on. But they didn't move. They were identical twins, no older than 6 or 7, and they wore worn winter coats, one red, one yellow, that had the look of clothes chosen with care, but used through many seasons. Their small hands were clasped together in front of them. Their heads were bowed. The posture was unmistakably intentional. These children were not lost. They were exactly where they meant to be. Richard walked toward them slowly, careful not to startle them. The gravel crunched softly under his shoes. He was maybe 10 feet away when he heard it. A small voice, hushed and careful, the way children speak when they understand that a place deserves quiet. "Thank you for saving Mommy." Richard's feet stopped moving of their own accord. Then a second voice, slightly softer, the twin echo of the first. "We miss you even though we never met you." The sound traveled through him like cold water. He stood there with the autumn wind pulling at his coat and his whole chest tightening around something he couldn't immediately name. His son Daniel had died 5 years ago. He had been 12 years old. These girls are nowhere near old enough to have known him. Richard breathed through the confusion and stepped forward carefully. He crouched down a few feet from the girls, bringing himself to their level. Up close, he could see that one of them had placed a small cluster of white daisies at the base of the headstone. The flowers were fresh, slightly damp from the morning air. "Hello," he said quietly. Both girls turned. They were beautiful children with large dark eyes and careful expressions, the kind of faces that had already learned to read adults before trusting them. They didn't run. They didn't look guilty. They looked at him the way children look at someone they have been expecting but weren't sure would actually show up. "We're sorry," the girl in the red coat said quickly. "We didn't mean to bother anyone." "You're not bothering me," Richard said, keeping his voice steady. "Can I ask your names?" The twins exchanged a look. One of those whole conversations passed in silence that only people who have grown up as two halves of one thing can manage. "I'm Amara," said the one in red. "I'm Nia," said the one in yellow. "Amara and Nia," Richard repeated. He glanced at the headstone, then back at the girls. "Do you know whose grave this is?" "Yes," Amara said without hesitation. "His name was Daniel. He saved our mom." Richard felt his throat tighten. He kept his expression neutral, with the practiced discipline of a man who had spent decades hiding reactions in negotiation rooms. But inside something was shifting, some large and foundational thing moving in a way he couldn't stop. "Tell me," he said, "what do you mean he saved your mom?" Nia was the one who answered this time. "Our mom says that when she was young and really scared, he helped her when nobody else did. She brings us here every year on this day because this is the day he died." She paused and looked down at the daisies. "She says we should never forget him. Our mom cries when she talks about it," Amara added, her voice dropping. "So we don't ask too many questions. But she always buys us flowers to bring." Richard's eyes moved to the daisies. Plain white daisies from grocery store, most likely. Not expensive, not elaborate. The kind of offering that costs almost nothing except the thought behind it. "What is your mother's name?" he asked. "Lena," Nia said. "Lena Carter." Richard didn't recognize the name. He ran through his memory the way he ran through anything that mattered, systematically, checking every shelf. Nothing. He had never heard of a Lena Carter. And yet these two little girls were kneeling at his son's grave in the cold October air, placing flowers there, saying prayers of thanks for a boy who had died before they were even born. He was about to ask another question when Amara reached into the pocket of her red coat and produced a small photograph. The edges were worn soft from handling, and the image had the slightly faded quality of a picture that had been looked at many times over many years. She held it out to him. Richard took it carefully and looked down. It was a photograph of a young woman sitting on a bus bench at night. She looked tired and frightened, her arms wrapped around herself, her face turned slightly toward the camera. Beside her, one arm resting on the bench back as if he had just sat down and was making himself at home in the most natural way possible, was a boy. Richard's breath left him entirely. The boy was Daniel. There was no mistaking it. The shape of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the particular way his hair fell slightly to one side. Richard had 100 photographs of Daniel at home, had memorized every feature the way a parent memorizes the face of their child without meaning to. This was his son, sitting on a bus bench at night in the rain, beside a frightened young woman he had apparently decided not to leave alone. Richard's hands were trembling. He had never seen this photograph in his life. He stood slowly, still holding the picture. When he looked up, the girls were watching him with steady, patient eyes. "Where does your mother live?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "We take the number 9 bus," Nia said helpfully. "We get off at Clearwater Street." "She said she wasn't sure if we should come today," Amara added. "But we always come. We told her we had to." Richard nodded, not trusting himself to say much more. He handed the photograph back carefully and watched Amara tuck it back in her pocket. "Thank you for telling me this," he said. The girls stood up and brushed grass from the knees of their coats with the automatic efficiency of children who do a lot of kneeling. They said a polite goodbye and walked away down the gravel path, their coats a spot of red and yellow against the gray autumn morning. Richard watched them until they passed through the iron gates. Then he turned back to the headstone and stood there for a long time. He had visited this grave every Sunday for 5 years, and he had always believed he was coming here to remember everything about his son. Every story, Every detail, every moment. Standing there in the October cold with his hands no longer quite steady, Richard Halstead understood for the first time that he might not have known the full story at all. Richard drove home with the photograph, burning in his memory the entire way. He went through the routine of his Sunday mechanically, changed his coat, sat at his desk, poured coffee he didn't drink. He kept seeing the image. Daniel on a bench at night in the rain, next to a young woman he had clearly sat down beside with the full intention of staying. The expression on Daniel's face in that photograph, calm and settled and completely certain he was doing exactly what needed to be done, was so achingly familiar that it made Richard's chest hurt. That was his boy. That was exactly who Daniel had been. By noon, he had called Marcus Webb, his head of private investigations, a man he had used for sensitive corporate matters for over a decade. He gave Marcus everything he had: the name Lena Carter, the number 9 bus route, Clearwater Street, and the description of the photograph. "I need to know who she is and where she lives," Richard said. Thoroughly, quietly. "Understood," Marcus said. "How quickly?" "Yesterday." But before Marcus could finish his work, Richard decided he couldn't simply wait. That had never been his nature. He had built an empire by moving toward problems rather than sitting at a distance and receiving reports about them. He got back in his plain dark sedan and drove to Clearwater Street. The neighborhood was a long way from the part of the city where Richard lived and worked. Not dangerous, but tired. The kind of streets where the buildings were functional rather than beautiful, where small grocery stores had handwritten signs in the window and the cars parked along the curb had a few more years of use on them than their drivers would have chosen. Children played on a concrete basketball court behind a chain-link fence. A woman in a yellow apron swept her front steps with the careful attention of someone who takes pride in what she can control. Richard parked and sat for a moment, watching the block. Then he got out and walked to the address Marcus had already managed to pull. A 3-story apartment building with a small buzzer panel beside the front door and a row of metal mailboxes in the entryway. He rang the bell for apartment 2B. A long pause, then a cautious voice through the intercom. "Who is it?" "My name is Richard Halstead," he said. "I met your daughters this morning. At the cemetery." Another pause, much longer this time. The door buzzed open. She was waiting in the hallway outside her apartment when he came up the stairs. Lena Carter was a young woman, early to mid-20s, with careful, watchful eyes and the posture of someone who had learned to be ready for things to go wrong. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater, her hair pulled back, and she was holding the door frame in a way that suggested she hadn't fully decided whether to let him in yet. She recognized him. He could see it immediately. Everyone who followed business news recognized Richard Halstead. He watched her recalibrate, adjusting to the reality of a billionaire standing in her apartment building hallway. And to her credit, she didn't flinch. "Amara and Nia said someone talked to them at the grave," she said. "I didn't realize," she stopped. "I'm sorry. Please come in." The apartment was small and clean. There was a narrow kitchen visible through a doorway, a living area with a couch that had seen better days, but was covered with a bright patterned throw, and drawings on the refrigerator held up with alphabet magnets. Everything in the space suggested someone who worked hard to make a limited amount of money cover everything it needed to cover. Richard sat in the chair she offered and held his coat in his lap. Lena sat across from him on the edge of the couch, her hands folded, her expression carefully composed. "They show me a photograph," Richard said. "Daniel and a young woman at a bus stop." Lena's composure cracked just slightly around the eyes. "Yes," she said. "That's me. How did they get that picture?" "I gave it to them. I thought they should know the story. The real version, not just the way I tell it when I'm trying not to cry." She looked down at her hands. "Someone took that photo from across the street. I never knew who. It appeared in my mailbox a few weeks after that night. No note, no name. I've always assumed it was someone who saw what happened and wanted me to have it." Richard absorbed this. Someone had been close enough to take that photograph and had thought to send it to Lena anonymously. He set that detail aside for later. "Tell me about that night," he said. "Please. Everything." Lena was quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they're deciding how far back to start. Then she began. She had been 17 years old. She had grown up in a household where love was conditional and pregnancy was not among the conditions. When her parents discovered she was pregnant, the argument that followed ended with her standing outside with a single bag and the door closed behind her. She had nowhere to go. She had almost no money. She had sat down on a bus bench in the rain because she didn't know what else to do, and the bench at least had a small overhead shelter. She had been sitting there crying for almost an hour when Daniel sat down beside her. He didn't ask her what was wrong right away. He just sat there for a moment, like someone who understood that questions weren't always what a person needed first. Then he asked if she was okay, and something about the way he asked it, straightforward and genuine, without any performance of concern, made her tell him the truth instead of the automatic, "I'm fine," she had ready. She told him she had been put out and had nowhere to stay and didn't know what to do about the baby. He nodded, not dramatically, just nodded, like this was information he was taking seriously and figuring out what to do with. He had $12 in his pocket, Lena said, and her voice thinned slightly at this detail. He walked to the corner store and came back with a sandwich and a bottle of water. He said I needed to eat something, and he was right, because I hadn't eaten since morning. She stopped briefly. Then he sat back down and pulled out his phone and started calling numbers. I didn't even know what he was calling at first. Then I realized he'd looked up emergency shelters in the area. He was just going through the list, one by one, asking if they had space. Richard was very still. He found one, Lena continued. A women's shelter about 4 miles away. They had a bed. He called them back and told them a pregnant teenager needed a place and asked them to send their van. And then he just sat there with me, waiting, making sure I wasn't alone until they came. Richard said nothing. The storm got worse, Lena said. The wind picked up and the rain was coming sideways by the time the van arrived. I tried to get him to wait inside somewhere until the rain stopped. I told him he should at least call someone pick him up. She paused. He said he only lived about a mile away. He said he'd walked home and worse. He said good night, and he went. She stopped. Richard's jaw was tight. He already knew what came next. He had known for 5 years what came next. He just hadn't known the rest of the story that surrounded it. The shelter called me the following day, Lena said quietly, to check on me. The woman on the phone mentioned that a boy had been the one to call them. She said she wanted to thank him, but didn't have a way to reach him. Lena looked up at Richard directly. I started trying to find him. I described him. 12 years old, looked like this, said he lived about a mile from the bus stop on Granger Avenue. She swallowed. A few days later, someone told me there had been an accident. A boy. That intersection. The apartment was very quiet. I found out his name from the news report, she said. Daniel Halstead. She looked at Richard steadily. I've been to that grave every year since. The first few years I went alone. Then Amara and Nia were old enough to understand a little, so I started bringing them. Richard looked at her for a long moment. Why didn't you contact me? He asked. When you found out who he was, you could have contacted me. Lena's expression shifted, something complicated moving through it. I was 17 and homeless and pregnant, she said evenly. And you are Richard Halstead. She let that sit without elaboration. He understood. He was in the rain for an hour, Richard said. It wasn't quite a question. At least, Lena said. Probably a little longer. Richard looked at the wall for a moment, then back at her. There was something specific that he needed to say, and he made himself say it plainly. My son died walking home from where he left you, about 6 blocks away. He was struck by a truck on Millard Road. Lena closed her eyes. He died because he was out in that storm, Richard said. If he had never stopped to help you. I know, Lena said. Her voice had gone very quiet. I've thought about that every single day for 7 years. The apartment was silent long enough that they could hear the sound of children playing outside, somewhere down on the street below. Lena pressed her fingers against her eyes briefly, then lowered her hands and sat up straight with the particular posture of someone who has had to keep going through things that broke them and has learned to make that look like strength. I used to think that too, she said, that his kindness is what killed him, that if he had just walked past me, mind his own business like everyone else that night, he'd still be here. She stopped, and then Amara and Nia were born, and they grew up, and I watched them become these people, these small whole people, and her voice steadied. I don't know how to hold both things at once. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I just know that they exist because he didn't walk past. The front door opened. Both of them looked up. Amara and Nia came in carrying their small backpacks, still wearing their coats from that morning's trip to the cemetery. They stopped in the doorway and looked at Richard with the careful assessment of children who have learned to read situations quickly. Then Amara looked at her mother. "Are you okay, Mom?" "Yes, baby," Lena said. "This is Mr. Halstead. He's Daniel's dad." Something moved through both girls' expressions simultaneously. The particular gravity of children who understand that this is a significant moment, even if they can't fully map all the reasons why. Nia walked over to Richard with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to be cautious about offering comfort. She hugged him. It was quick and small, the brief, fierce hug of a child who has decided someone needs one. Richard sat completely still for the 3 seconds it lasted, and when she stepped back, he found that his eyes were burning. "We pray for Daniel every year," Nia told him seriously. "We're going to keep doing it forever." "She means it," Amara confirmed. "We made a pact." Richard looked at these two girls in their worn coats, one red, one yellow, standing in their small, clean apartment on Clearwater Street, and something happened to him that hadn't happened in 5 years. The long, frozen thing that had been sitting behind his sternum since the night of Daniel's accident began, very slowly, to move. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth for a moment. Then he lowered it. "I'm glad you do," he said. His voice was rougher than he would have liked. He would have thought that was pretty great. He stayed another half hour. The girls showed him drawings they had made. Nia showed him one she described as Daniel in heaven, which appeared to be a stick figure surrounded by many cheerful clouds. Richard looked at it for a long time. When he left and walked back to his car, the afternoon light was coming at a low angle through the street trees, and the block looked different than it had when he arrived. Not better or worse exactly, just seen. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. He had come to this neighborhood because a little girl had told him about a bus stop and a boy in a storm. He had expected to find a story that might explain something. What he had found instead was the part of his son's life he hadn't known existed. The hour before the accident. The kindness that nobody had told him about because nobody had known to connect it. He started the car. As he pulled away from Clearwater Street, he understood that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. There were still questions without answers. Who had been behind that camera, and why the photograph had arrived anonymously at Lena's door, and what else about Daniel's final hours might be waiting to be found. Richard Halstead drove home through the autumn afternoon and made a decision. He was going to find out everything. The days following Richard's visit to Clearwater Street were not peaceful ones. He had returned home with Lena's story settled in his chest like something warm and something devastating at the same time, and he had sat in his study that evening turning the details over the way a man turns a stone in his hand, feeling its weight, checking its edges. Everything Lena had told him was believable. Everything aligned with the boy Richard knew Daniel to be. The kindness, the practicality, the refusal to leave someone alone in the rain. That was Daniel exactly. There was no part of the story that surprised him in terms of character. But something else was bothering him, and it took him until nearly midnight to name it. The photograph. Someone had been close enough to that bus stop to frame a clear shot of Daniel and Lena sitting together in a storm. Close enough to capture the angle, the timing, the whole quiet scene of a 12-year-old boy sitting beside a frightened teenage girl on a rain-soaked bench. And then that same someone had developed that photograph, or printed it, or however they had handled it, and mailed it without a note or a name to Lena's address. That wasn't a random act of kindness from a passing stranger. That was someone who had been watching. Richard called Marcus Webb before 8 the next morning. He told Marcus he needed something new added to the investigation. He needed to know who had taken that photograph and how they had known where to send it. Marcus said he'd get to work. What Marcus found over the next 4 days rearranged everything. The first thread came from the shelter. Marcus contacted the women's shelter that had responded to Daniel's call that night and explained, carefully, with enough of the truth to get cooperation, that he was investigating a historical matter connected to a young man who had called them during a storm 7 years ago. The shelter director, an older woman named Patricia, was helpful. She pulled the intake records from that night. Lena Carter was in the file. Arrival time, intake notes, assigned room. But when Marcus asked who had placed the initial call, Patricia read him the name from the record. It wasn't Daniel. The call had been logged under the name Walter Briggs. Marcus reported this to Richard, who went very still in his office chair. He asked Marcus to repeat it. Marcus did. Richard wrote the name down on the notepad he kept beside his phone. Walter Briggs. He didn't recognize it. He asked Marcus to find out who Walter Briggs was. That took another 2 days. What came back was this. Walter Briggs had been a corporate driver employed by Halstead Logistics for 3 years. He had driven executives, handled airport pickups, and done various ground-level transport work for the company. His employment record was clean, his reviews average, his presence unremarkable in the way of people who do their jobs without making impressions. He had resigned the day after Daniel's accident. He had not given notice. He had not collected his final paycheck in person. He had submitted a one-line resignation email and disappeared. Richard read this report standing at his window, with the city spread out 30 floors below him, and he felt the specific cold that comes not from temperature, but from a certain kind of knowledge arriving ahead of your ability to process it. A driver from his own company had been at that bus stop the night his son died. That driver had called the shelter, not Daniel. And then that driver had quit without warning the morning after the accident and had not been seen since. Richard called Lena. He kept his voice even and asked her one question. Had she noticed any vehicles parked near the bus stop that night? Any cars that seemed to be waiting nearby? There was a pause on the other end. There was an SUV, she said, dark-colored. It was parked about half a block down. I noticed it because it was there when I arrived, and it was still there when the shelter van came. I assumed it was someone waiting for somebody. A shorter pause. I didn't think about it again until now. Richard thanked her and ended the call. He stood at the window for a long time. His company's driver had been parked outside that bus stop during the entire encounter between Daniel and Lena. He had stayed long enough to see Daniel leave with the shelter van. He had, apparently, also been close enough to take the photograph, though that part was still unconfirmed. And then he had quit his job the next morning and gone somewhere no one had thought to look. The question that was assembling itself in Richard's mind was one he didn't want to finish building, because once it was fully formed, it would ask whether his son's death had been an accident at all. Richard called Marcus again. He told him to find Walter Briggs, not just his employment record, the man himself. In the meantime, Richard went back to Lena. He drove to Clearwater Street on a Tuesday afternoon when the girls were at school, and Lena answered the door with flour on her hands from something she'd been making in the kitchen. He sat down at her small table and told her what his investigation had found. He told her about the shelter record. He told her about Walter Briggs and about the SUV and about what it might mean that a driver from his own company had been parked outside that bus stop for the duration of the time his 12-year-old son sat beside her in the rain. Lena listened without interrupting. She was very still. Her hands rested flat on the table, and she looked at them while he talked. When he finished, she looked up at him. You think someone was following Daniel, she said. I think someone was watching him, Richard said. Whether that means following or whether it means something else, I don't know yet. If someone was watching him, she stopped. Her expression changed. He watched her arrive at the same destination he had been standing at for days. If someone was watching him that night, and he died that same night. I don't know what it means yet, Richard said. That's the truth. I don't want to tell you something I haven't confirmed. Lena nodded slowly, but the fear that had settled into her face didn't leave. Richard looked at the refrigerator with its drawings and magnets and the small details of a life that had been built from almost nothing. He thought about the girls who had come here every year with grocery store flowers. He thought about the note in Daniel's handwriting that he hadn't heard about yet, though he would. Before he left, he turned in the doorway and said something that came out of him not as a corporate decision or a strategic move, but as the plain truth of what he intended. I promised your daughters I would find out what really happened to the boy who saved their mother, he said. I meant it. Lena looked at him steadily. I know you did, she said. He went back to his car and sat behind the wheel for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and called Marcus and told him that finding Walter Briggs was now the single most important task his team had. He drove away from Clearwater Street with the autumn trees blurring past the windows and the question fully formed now in his mind whether he wanted it there or not. Somebody had been watching his son the night Daniel died. and somebody had made sure nobody ever found out. Walter Briggs was not living well. Marcus found him 11 days after Richard made the call, in a small town in rural Tennessee, in a house that sat at the end of a gravel lane with a rusted mailbox out front and a vegetable garden along the side that hadn't been tended in weeks. He was going by the name Dale Warren. He had a Tennessee driver's license under that name and had lived quietly in the area for 4 years. He worked part-time at a hardware store, paid cash for everything he could, and had no social media presence and no apparent connections to his former life. He was in every visible way a man trying not to be found. Richard's security team located the house on a Thursday. Richard flew down on Friday morning, alone except for Marcus, which was how he had wanted it. No lawyers, no assistants, no corporate presence. Just him and the thing he needed to know. The drive from the airfield to the gravel lane took 40 minutes through countryside that had gone quiet with the approach of winter. Marcus drove. Richard watched the fields pass and said nothing. The man who answered the door was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with thinning gray hair and the complexion of someone who had not slept well in a long time. When he saw Richard Halstead standing on his front step, he went white from the throat up. He tried to close the door. Marcus put a hand against it, gently but with the kind of authority that doesn't require force. "Mr. Briggs," Richard said, "I think you know why I'm here." Walter Briggs, Dale Warren, stood in the doorway and looked at Richard with the expression of a man who has been bracing for something for years and is standing in a moment he feared and finding it both worse and better than he imagined. Worse because it was real, better because at least the waiting was over. "Come in," he said finally. His voice was rough from something more than age. The inside of the house was dim and plain. Briggs sat at his kitchen table, and Richard sat across from him, and Marcus stood near the door with his arms folded. No recording equipment. Richard had made that decision deliberately. He didn't need a confession for a court. He needed the truth for himself. "I know you were there," Richard said. He kept his voice even and measured. He had spent decades in rooms where control of tone was the difference between winning and losing, and he brought every bit of that discipline to this small kitchen with the water-stained ceiling. "I know you were parked outside the bus stop that night. I know you called the shelter under your own name instead of Daniel's. I know you quit Halstead Logistics the morning after my son died and have been living under a different name ever since." He looked directly at Briggs. What I need to know is why. Briggs had his hands folded on the table in front of him, and he looked down at them. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Richard waited without moving. Then Briggs said, "I didn't want anyone to get hurt." "Tell me everything," Richard said. "From the beginning." Briggs exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. He began. Approximately 8 months before Daniel's accident, Briggs had been approached by a man named Carver. He said Carver had found him through back channels, people who knew people who dealt in the kind of quiet work that corporations occasionally required but couldn't officially sanction. Briggs had done similar work before. Not violent, he was careful to clarify that, just surveillance, information gathering, logistics. He had done it 3 or 4 times over the years for various clients and had never been in a situation that turned dangerous. Carver represented a company called Meridian Partners. Richard knew the name immediately. Meridian had been a direct corporate competitor during one of the most contentious periods in Halstead Logistics history. They had attempted 2 hostile takeovers in a single year, both of which Richard had defeated through a combination of legal maneuvering and shareholder loyalty that had cost him enormous time and energy. They had been relentless, and they had been ruthless, and eventually they had retreated. But apparently they had not retreated entirely. The assignment Carver brought to Briggs was straightforward in its mechanics and monstrous in its purpose. Briggs was to track Daniel Halstead's movements. Routine information. Where he went after school, what his schedule looked like, whether there were gaps in his day when he was alone and unmonitored. The objective, Briggs said, had not been spelled out explicitly, but the clear implication was that Daniel could be used as leverage. If Meridian could get control of the boy, or even credibly threatened to, Richard would have no choice but to come to the table. Richard absorbed this without visible reaction, though his jaw had set so hard it ached. Briggs had taken the assignment. He wasn't proud of it now, and he hadn't been proud of it then, but he had taken it. He had spent 3 weeks tracking Daniel's movements from a distance, logging his schedule, noting his habits. Daniel was a regular kid with a regular routine: school, occasional stops at a library or a friend's house home. Then came a night of the storm. Briggs had followed Daniel from school that day, as usual, but Daniel had deviated from his normal route. Instead of heading directly home, he had gone toward a bus stop several blocks away. Briggs had parked and watched. He had seen Daniel notice the young woman on the bench. He had watched Daniel sit down beside her. At this point in the telling, Briggs stopped. He pressed his folded hands against his mouth briefly, then lowered them. "That kid," he said. He didn't know her. She was a stranger. It was cold and it was raining, and he sat down next to her like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he started trying to help her. Briggs shook his head slowly. "I've done a lot of things in my life that I'm not proud of. I've been in rooms with people who didn't have a good bone in their body, and I've helped them do things I should have refused. But watching that kid sit in the rain with that girl and make phone calls to find her somewhere to sleep," he stopped again. "Something happened. I can't explain it better than that. Something happened, and I knew I was done." Briggs said he had made the call to the shelter himself because Daniel's phone had run out of battery and he had been struggling to find a number that worked. Briggs had stepped in remotely, calling from his car, giving his own name without thinking about the implications. He had watched the shelter van arrive. He had watched Daniel speak to Lena one last time and then begin walking. He had started his car with the intention of following Daniel home, not to gather more information, but because something in him needed to see the boy arrive safely. Some residual obligation to the human being he had spent weeks surveilling. But he had been blocked by a delivery truck pulling out from a side street, and it had taken him nearly 2 minutes to get clear. By the time he turned onto Millard Road, the accident had already happened. Briggs described what he saw in the flat, drained voice of someone who has recounted something to themselves so many times that the recounting itself has become its own kind of wound. The truck on its side in the rain. The emergency lights from a car that had stopped. The shape on the road that he knew immediately was Daniel. He had not stopped. He had driven past slowly and then driven away and had sat in a parking garage 3 miles away for 3 hours without moving. Then he had gone home and submitted his resignation. Richard was looking at the table when Briggs finished. He was quiet for a long time. "You saw my son die," Richard said finally. His voice was completely level. "And you drove away." "Yes," Briggs said. "And you never came forward." "No, because you were afraid." Briggs nodded. Carver and the people behind him. If I had gone to the police, if I had told anyone about the surveillance, they would have known. And people like that don't accept that kind of exposure quietly. He looked at Richard directly. "I was a coward. I know that. I've known it every day since." Richard looked at him for a long moment. There was rage present. He could feel it, but underneath the rage was something more complicated. The knowledge that Briggs had hesitated, had felt something watching Daniel, had tried in some small way to maintain some thread of conscience, even in the middle of a deeply wrong thing. That didn't forgive anything, but it was a distinction that mattered. "Who hired you through Carver?" Richard said. "What name did you have?" Briggs shook his head slowly. "Carver never gave me the end client's name directly, but I found out afterward. I did my own digging because I needed to know who I'd been working for." He met Richard's eyes. The money came from an internal account inside Halstead Logistics. Somebody inside your company arranged the financing for Meridian's operation. Somebody on the inside was helping them from the beginning. The kitchen was silent except for the wind against the window. Richard felt the full weight of it descend. Not just the exterior threat, not just the faceless executives at Meridian, but someone inside his own company. Someone who had sat in his meetings and attended his son's funeral and perhaps offered condolences and shaken his hand and carried the knowledge of what they had arranged the entire time. "Do you know who?" Richard asked. "No," Briggs said. "I have the account routing information. It's partial, but it points back to Halstead Logistics' internal financials. Someone above the driver level. Someone with access to off-book transfers." Richard stood. He straightened his coat. He looked at Walter Briggs for one final moment and made a decision about what he was going to say. "You're going to write down everything you just told me," he said. "Dates, Carver's description, the account information, Every detail you remember. You're going to give that to Marcus before we leave today. He paused. I'm not going to make you a promise about what comes next, but I'm going to tell you this. My son died in the rain after spending an hour helping a stranger because that was who he was. Whatever you did or didn't do, you were there. And somewhere in you, that registered. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't mean anything. Briggs looked like a man who had been handed something he wasn't sure he deserved. His eyes were red-rimmed. Richard walked to the door. Marcus was already moving to sit with Briggs and take down the written account. Richard stepped outside onto the gravel. The Tennessee sky was pale and wide above the bare trees and the fields. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets. Daniel had been followed. His son had walked through his last day on Earth with someone watching him from a dark vehicle, tracking his movements, gathering information that was meant to be used against Richard's family. And Daniel had never known. He had just lived his day the way he always lived his days, noticing what needed to be noticed, doing what needed to be done, sitting down next to a frightened girl in the rain because it was the obvious right thing to do. And then he had walked home through a storm and been struck by a truck and died. And the people responsible had gone on living their lives. Richard got in the car and waited for Marcus. When Marcus came out 20 minutes later with several pages of handwritten notes, Richard took them and folded them carefully into his inside coat pocket. On the flight back, he said very little. He held the notes in his pocket and thought about Lena's apartment, about the drawings on the refrigerator, about Nia's brief, ferocious hug and Amara's careful eyes, and the two small daisies placed at Daniel's grave with the seriousness of children who understood that some debts are paid not with money, but with memory. He thought about his son, 12 years old, sitting on a bench in a storm with $12 in his pocket, making phone calls for a stranger. He thought about the person inside his own company who had helped engineer the surveillance of that boy. When the plane landed, Richard's assistant was waiting with the car. Richard got in and looked out the window as the city came back around him, the towers and the traffic and the ordinary business of people going about their lives. Tell legal I need a full internal audit authorized by end of business tomorrow, he said quietly. Tell them it's comprehensive and confidential. No department heads notified in advance. His assistant wrote it down without asking questions. That was what made her good at her job. Richard looked out the window and said nothing else. He was going to find the person who had helped destroy his son's last day on Earth. And he was going to start from the inside. The internal audit began on a Monday morning before anyone arrived at Halstead Logistics headquarters. Richard had arranged it that way deliberately. The audit team, 3 external forensic accountants he trusted absolutely, people who had never worked a day inside his company and therefore owed nothing to anyone inside it, were given access to the server room at 5 in the morning, 2 hours before the earliest employees arrived. By the time the building filled with its usual Monday energy, the audit team was already 3 levels deep into financial records that hadn't been examined since the year of Daniel's death. Richard did not go to the office that day. He worked from home, which he almost never did, and he kept his phone close and waited. The first flag came back by early afternoon. It was a series of transfers, not large individually, which was almost certainly intentional. Amounts between $8,000 and $20,000, spread across a period of about 14 months, routed through what appeared on the surface to be a vendor account. Routine payments for consulting services. The kind of line item that a busy finance department might review for 30 seconds and approve without concern. But the vendor didn't exist. The company name on the account was registered to a shell corporation in Delaware with no employees, no website, no physical address, and no history of any actual services rendered to Halstead Logistics. The money had passed through that shell and then moved again, 2 more hops through 2 more empty entities, before landing in an account that the forensic team traced, with considerable effort, to a holding company connected to Meridian Partners. Richard sat in his home office and read the report 3 times. Someone at Halstead Logistics had been funneling money to the competitor that had tried to destroy them. The payments corresponded almost exactly to the period during which Walter Briggs had been hired to conduct surveillance on Daniel. The audit team needed another day to follow the authorization trail. to trace who inside the company had the access and authority to set up those vendor payments and approve those transfers without triggering normal review. Richard told them to take whatever time they needed and to tell no one what they were looking for. The name came back the following afternoon. Victor Langford. Richard had known Victor for 15 years. They had built the company together through its most difficult growth period, the years when Halstead Logistics was expanding faster than its infrastructure could support, and every quarter felt like controlled chaos. Victor had been the one who brought order to the finances during that period, who had an almost instinctive ability to find efficiencies and structure deals in ways that protected the company's balance sheet. Richard had trusted him the way you trust someone who has stood beside you in genuinely hard times. Victor had resigned 5 years ago, 3 months after Daniel's death. He had cited burnout and a desire to pursue private interests. Richard had been so deep in grief during that period that he had processed Victor's departure as another piece of the general dissolution that followed losing Daniel. He had let him go without significant examination. Now he understood why Victor had gone when he did. The investigators located Victor within 48 hours. He was not hiding, not the way Briggs had been hiding. Victor had simply relocated. He was living in a coastal city in Portugal, in a well-appointed apartment with a harbor view, apparently consulting for several European financial firms. He was visible on professional networking sites. He had a comfortable life and no apparent anxiety about being found. That told Richard something. Victor believed his tracks were clean enough. He believed the distance of years and geography had handled the problem. He was wrong. Before Richard made any move toward Victor, he went to see Lena. He drove to Clearwater Street on a Thursday evening. The girls were home from school, doing homework at the kitchen table, and Lena was cooking something that filled the apartment with the smell of onions and warm spice. She turned down the stove and sat across from Richard while the girls continued their work with the focused industry of children who had been raised to take school seriously. Richard told her what the investigation had found. He kept it factual and as clear as he could make it. A former executive inside his company had helped a rival corporation finance the surveillance of Daniel. The intention had been to gather leverage, enough information, or ultimately enough physical access to Daniel that Richard could be coerced into selling the company. The plan had never reached its worst stages because Briggs had abandoned it the night he watched Daniel help her. But the architecture of it had existed. Daniel had been targeted deliberately and with planning, as a means to get to Richard. Lena was quiet throughout. She had the stillness of someone who has already imagined terrible things and is now hearing confirmation rather than surprise. When Richard finished, she looked at her hands on the table for a moment. Then she said, "He had no idea." "No," Richard said. "None. He just thought he was walking home from a bus stop," she said. "He thought the worst thing about that night was the rain." "Yes." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something in her expression that Richard recognized as the particular anguish of a person who has been carrying a specific guilt. The guilt of having been the reason someone deviated from their safe path, and has just had that guilt transformed into something more complicated and more vast. The accident had not been purely random chance. There had been people who had chosen to put Daniel in a position of vulnerability. And yet, Daniel himself had chosen to stop, had chosen to help, had made that choice out of no context except his own character. He still would have stopped, Lena said quietly. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Richard said. "He absolutely would have." They sat with that for a moment. From the kitchen table, without looking up from her worksheet, Amara said, "Mom says Daniel was brave because he helped someone who needed it." Nia lifted her head. "That means he died doing the right thing," she said. The simplicity of it landed in the room with the weight of something a great deal larger than the small voice that carried it. Richard looked at these two girls, 7 years old, and already carrying more gravity than most adults he had sat across from in boardrooms. He thought about the note Lena had mentioned once in passing, a folded piece of paper Daniel had given her before he left the bus stop. He hadn't asked about it then, because the conversation had moved elsewhere, but now he asked. Lena went to a box she kept on the high shelf in the hallway closet. She brought it to the table, opened it, and from beneath a small collection of photographs and folded papers, she drew out a piece of paper that had been folded into quarters and handled enough times that the creases were soft. She unfolded it and handed it to Richard. The handwriting was Daniel's. Richard knew it instantly, the particular way his son formed his letters, slightly uneven in size, but careful in intention. The handwriting of a kid who was always more interested in what he was saying than in how the letters looked. Don't worry. Things always get better. One day your kids will know you fought for them. And if you ever feel alone, just remember someone believed in you. Richard sat very still with the paper in his hands. He had found notes like this before. Not this one, but others. Daniel had a habit of writing small encouragements and leaving them in places where people might find them, tucked into a classmate's locker, left on the kitchen counter for the housekeeper on a Monday morning, once placed inside a library book he was returning. It had been one of the quiet things about Daniel that Richard had loved fiercely and never fully known how to describe to people who asked what he'd been like. His son had believed in the power of telling people they were worth something, even strangers, even briefly, even on the last night of his life. Richard refolded the note with great care and handed it back to Lena. She put it back in a box and returned the box to its shelf. He stayed another hour. He didn't talk about Victor Langford again. He just sat in the small, warm apartment while the girls finished their homework and Lena heated dinner, and the ordinary domestic sounds of the evening moved around him, and he let himself feel the specific ache of understanding that his son's kindness had created this family, this life, these two girls at this table, while also understanding that someone had tried to use that same boy as a corporate chess piece. When he left, he stood at the door and said, "I'm going to handle the rest of this." Lena nodded. "I know," she said. Richard flew to Portugal 3 days later. The city was beautiful in the way of places that have existed long enough to accumulate a particular quality of light. Richard arrived in the late afternoon when the sun was coming at a low angle off the harbor, and the white buildings along the waterfront were catching it in a way that made everything look warm and uncomplicated. He had been to this city before, years ago, for different reasons entirely. He had no attachment to it now, except as the location of a conversation he had been building toward for weeks. Victor Langford had not been notified of the visit. Richard had thought about this carefully. A man who believed his tracks were clean might run if warned, and running would force a different kind of resolution. Legal proceedings, international jurisdictions, delays measured in years. Richard did not want years. He wanted the truth in a room, face to face, the way he had always preferred to handle the things that actually mattered. Marcus had confirmed Victor's regular Thursday lunch reservation at a restaurant near the harbor, a Portuguese seafood place he apparently visited every week. Creatures of habit made things simpler. Richard arrived at the restaurant at 20 past noon and asked for a table inside, away from the waterfront terrace. He ordered coffee and waited. Victor walked in at 12:30. He was 63 now, and he wore it well. Silver-haired, well-dressed, the comfortable ease of a man who had moved from one comfortable chapter to another. He stopped at the entrance and spoke to the host. Then he turned toward his usual table. He saw Richard. The color left his face the way water leaves a glass when you tip it over, completely and immediately. Richard raised a hand in a small wave. Not aggressive, almost pleasant. Victor came to the table because there was nothing else he could do. He sat down across from Richard and said nothing for a moment, composing himself with the discipline of a man who had spent his career in rooms where composure was a form of power. "Richard," he said finally. "Victor," Richard said. "You look well. What are you doing here?" "Having lunch." Richard set down his coffee cup and finishing a conversation that's been waiting 5 years. Victor's eyes were steady, but his right hand on the table was not. The fingers moved slightly, a small involuntary adjustment of position, and Richard noted it the way he noted everything in a room where the real information was never in the words. "I don't know what you think you found," Victor said. "Then let me tell you," Richard said pleasantly, "and you can tell me where I've gotten it wrong." He laid out methodically the vendor accounts, the shell companies, the routing to Meridian Partners, the timeline that placed the payments exactly within the window of the surveillance operation. Walter Briggs' written account, the shelter record with Briggs' name, The partial routing information that traced back to internal authorizations made under Victor's access credentials. He placed nothing on the table physically. He kept everything in his voice, organized and unhurried, the way he would present a business case to a skeptical board. He watched Victor's face while he talked. By the time he reached Briggs' account, the last of Victor's composure had gone somewhere beneath the surface, visible now only in the tightness around his eyes and the way he had stopped moving entirely, the stillness of a man holding himself carefully together. When Richard finished, the table was quiet. Then Victor said, "I never intended for anyone to get hurt." "I know," Richard said. "Tell me anyway." Victor looked at the harbor through the window. When he spoke, his voice had changed registers, flatter, older, stripped of the professional cadence that had defined it for 30 years. Meridian Partners had approached him 18 months before Daniel's death. Their offer had been straightforward and obscene in its financial generosity. Help engineer the conditions for a hostile acquisition of Halstead Logistics, and Victor would receive a consulting agreement worth $8 million once the deal was concluded. The plan was to create leverage on Richard, something that would force him to the table and make him willing to accept terms he would otherwise never consider. Richard's only vulnerability, Meridian's people had determined, was Daniel. Victor had told himself the plan would never reach the point of actual harm. He had told himself that the surveillance was just information gathering, that the leverage would be applied through threat and implication rather than action, that Richard would sell and the whole thing would conclude as a business transaction. He had told himself this with enough conviction to authorize the payments through disguised vendor accounts, to connect Briggs with Carver, to set the machinery in motion. And then Daniel had died. Not because of the plan, not directly, a truck on a wet road, a driver who braked too late, the random violence of weather and timing, but in circumstances created partly by the fact that Daniel had been followed that night by a man paid to track him, which had put Briggs at that bus stop, which had meant a specific sequence of events that would not have assembled themselves otherwise. Victor had known immediately. When the news reached him the following morning, he had understood with absolute clarity that the surveillance he had authorized had been active on the night of Daniel's death, that Briggs had been there, that if this ever surfaced, the chain of responsibility led directly back to him. He had spent 3 days destroying records. He had worked quietly and thoroughly, pulling files, deleting communications, ensuring the vendor accounts were buried deep enough that a routine audit would not find them. Then he had resigned, constructed a plausible explanation about burnout and personal priorities, and left. "You watched me grieve," Richard said. His voice had not changed pitch, but something in it had changed quality, the way a very cold thing and a very hot thing can both burn. "You attended the memorial. You sat in my office while I was trying to hold the company together and hold myself together, and you knew what you had done." "Yes," Victor said. "And you said nothing." "No." Richard looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the harbor moved in the afternoon light, boats turning on their anchors, the water doing its constant, indifferent work. "Tell me the rest," Richard said. "What haven't I found yet?" Victor hesitated. The hesitation was brief, but Richard caught it, the same way he caught everything. "There was someone else," Victor said. "After Daniel died, when I was destroying the records, I needed help with one piece of it. The paper trail inside the legal department, communications that I couldn't access directly without triggering a review flag." He stopped. "I brought in someone else, someone who had the legal department access and who I trusted to understand why the records needed to go." "Who?" Richard said. "Michael Grant." Richard's expression did not change. He had learned this stillness over many years, and it served him now, because what moved through him in that moment was considerable. Michael Grant had been his legal advisor for over a decade. He had been one of the people Richard leaned on most heavily in the months after Daniel's death, when the company's governance required attention that Richard could barely summon. Michael had been, in every external appearance, a steady and loyal presence during the worst period of Richard's life. "He knew about the surveillance?" Richard asked. "No," Victor said quickly. "Not before Daniel died. I never told him the full context. I told him there were sensitive communications that needed to be removed from the record for reasons I couldn't fully explain, and that it was critical for the company's stability. I gave him a story about a regulatory vulnerability. He didn't ask enough questions. Victor paused, or he asked just enough to give himself a reason to help without knowing more. He helped you cover it up, Richard said. He helped me clean a record, Victor said. He had enough sense to understand that the cleaning itself was the story, even if he didn't know the original one. Richard sat with this. The restaurant had filled around them while they talked. Ordinary people at ordinary tables. The sounds of conversation and silverware and a television behind the bar showing a football match. The comfortable noise of a world that had no idea what was being said at this particular table by the window. You destroyed records about my son's death, Richard said. And then you helped yourself to a harbor view in Portugal. Victor looked at him directly. It was the first time in the conversation that his gaze had been fully steady. And what was in it was not defiance, but something more complicated. The expression of a man who has looked at himself honestly and found the view unbearable and has had to keep living anyway. There is nothing I can tell you that will matter, Victor said. I know that. There's no version of an explanation that changes what it is. No, Richard said. There isn't. He stood. He put on his jacket and laid enough cash on the table for both coffees and a tip that would be considered generous. He looked at Victor Langford for the last time. I'm going back to the United States, he said. I'm going to cooperate fully with every relevant authority. The routing records, Briggs' testimony, and everything you just told me are going to be provided to people whose job it is to decide what comes next for you and for Grant. He paused. You should probably speak to a lawyer before the weekend. He walked out of the restaurant into the harbor light. He didn't look back. Marcus was waiting with the car at the end of the block. Richard got in and sat back and looked out the window at the city moving past. For a few minutes, he didn't speak. He let the conversation settle in the way that important things need time to settle. Not because they become lighter, but because they take on their real shape when the immediate pressure of the moment is no longer compressing them. We have everything? He asked. Everything, Marcus said. The audit documents, Briggs' sign account, the routing records, and whatever you got in there. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Is it enough? It's enough, Richard said. He flew home through the night. He did not sleep on the plane, which was unusual for him. He had always been able to sleep on flights, a practical skill learned from years of crossing time zones for deals. But tonight he sat with the overhead light on and the document folder on the tray table in front of him, and he thought about Daniel. He thought about his son carrying $12 in his pocket and sitting down in the rain beside a frightened stranger. He thought about the note, "Someone believed in you," written in that slightly uneven handwriting and folded into quarters and kept in a box on a high shelf for 7 years by a woman who understood better than anyone what it meant to have been seen at the moment you most needed it. He thought about the fact that a 12-year-old boy had moved through his last hours on Earth with more dignity and more genuine courage than the adults who had been arranging the world around him like pieces on a board. Daniel had known nothing about Meridian Partners or Victor Langford or the corporate war being fought over his father's company. He had just been a boy walking home from school who noticed someone sitting alone in the rain and made an uncomplicated decision to stop. And that decision, that one simple human decision, had rippled forward through 7 years and become 2 girls in worn coats placing daisies on a headstone and a young woman who had built a life out of the foundation of a stranger's kindness and a father who was finally, after 5 long years, coming home from Portugal with the truth in his pocket. The plane banked over the Atlantic, and the lights of the eastern seaboard appeared below, spread across the dark like something that didn't know it was beautiful. Richard closed the folder and looked out the window. There was one more thing to do. Richard landed before dawn. The city was still dark when the car pulled away from the airfield, the streets quiet in the way that cities are quiet only in those few hours between the last of the night and the first of the morning. He sat in the back seat and watched the empty roads pass and felt the particular stillness of a man who has traveled a great distance toward something and has now arrived. He went home. He slept for 4 hours, which was more than he expected. When he woke, the light was gray and thin at the window, and he lay still for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. Then he got up and dressed and made coffee and sat at his desk with the folder open in front of him. He had the routing records. He had Briggs' signed account. He had the audit documentation tracing the vendor payments back through 3 shell entities to the Meridian-connected holding company. He had everything from the conversation in Portugal, recorded on a device Marcus had confirmed was legally permissible under the jurisdiction where it was made. He had more than enough. What he did not yet have was Michael Grant. He called his attorney first. Not Grant, someone else. A woman named Patricia Osei who handled Richard's most sensitive personal legal matters and who had an instinctive ability to assess a situation and identify exactly what it required. He told her he needed an hour of her time that morning and that she should clear everything else. She agreed without hesitation. Patricia arrived at 9. She sat across from Richard at his desk and read through the documents he had prepared with the focused silence of someone doing the thing they are best at. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at him. "This is substantial," she said. "I know," Richard said. "Victor Langford and Michael Grant are both exposed here. The fraud charges alone are serious. The conspiracy elements, authorizing surveillance of a minor with the intention of using him as leverage for coercion. That's a different level of exposure. What's your recommendation?" Richard asked. "Take it to the federal prosecutor's office directly," she said. "Don't go through local channels. This crosses state lines, and it has a corporate fraud component that puts it squarely in federal territory. I'll make the call this morning if you want." "Make the call," Richard said. She made the call. What followed was not quick, which Richard had expected. Federal processes rarely are. But the initial response was serious. A meeting with prosecutors that afternoon, document handover, a formal request that Richard make himself available for further interviews in the coming days. The prosecutors were careful and measured in the way of people who are constructing something that needs to hold weight. They asked their questions and took their notes and gave Richard nothing by way of timeline or prediction. He had set in motion. The rest was out of his hands. What remained in his hands was Michael Grant. He had thought carefully about how to handle this. Grant had not been the architect of the conspiracy. Victor had been explicit about that. Grant had not known about the surveillance on Daniel, had not known about the Meridian scheme, had not known that the records he helped sanitize were connected to the death of a child. But he had known that something needed to be covered, and he had helped cover it. And he had done so in the service of protecting Victor Langford, while telling himself it was about protecting the company. That distinction, Richard had decided, was not sufficient. He called Grant's office and left a message asking him to come to the house that evening. He said it was personal and important and that it required a conversation in private. The message was calm and gave nothing away. He had learned over decades that giving a man time to prepare his defenses before a confrontation produced less truth than giving him as little warning as possible. Grant would know something was coming. The call itself would tell him that, but he would not know what, and the uncertainty would do the necessary work in the hours between the message and the meeting. Grant arrived at 7. He looked like a man who had spent the afternoon composing and discarding responses to questions he didn't yet know. He was in his mid-50s, trim, careful in the way of lawyers who have spent careers managing other people's problems, and his face when Richard opened the door had the controlled blankness of someone who has decided in advance to say as little as possible. Richard brought him to the study and closed the door. He did not begin with the documents. He began by telling Grant about the twins. He described the morning in the cemetery, the red coat and the yellow coat, the small hands folded in prayer, the words he had overheard before he reached the grave. He described Lena's apartment on Clearwater Street, the drawings on the refrigerator, the note Daniel had written on the last night of his life. He told Grant about Briggs, about the shelter record, about the conversation in Tennessee, and the written account sitting in a folder with the federal prosecutor's office. He told Grant all of it slowly and without interruption, watching the man's face the entire time. By the time he reached Victor's name, the controlled blankness was gone. "Victor told me everything," Richard said. "About the records, about what you helped him remove and why, about the conversation you had in those days after Daniel died." Grant's hands were resting on his knees, and they were very still. "Richard, I want you to understand something before you say anything," Richard said. "I have already given the documentation to federal prosecutors. This conversation is not about whether consequences will follow. They will. What this conversation is about is whether you can look me in the eye and tell me the truth about what happened." A long silence settled over the study, the kind of silence that has actual weight. Grant looked at him. "I didn't know what the records were connected to," he said. "That's the truth. Victor told me there was a regulatory vulnerability. He told me certain communications needed to come out of the system before an audit created a problem. I knew it wasn't entirely clean, but I told myself." He stopped. "You told yourself what?" Richard said. "That I was protecting the company," Grant said. "That I was protecting the jobs of the people who depended on it. That it was a business decision with a specific, practical justification." He looked at his hands. "I didn't ask because I didn't want to know. And not asking was a choice I made because I knew that if I asked and found out what it really was, I would have to say no." "And you didn't want to say no?" Richard said. "No," Grant said quietly. "I didn't." Richard looked at the man across from him, a man he had trusted with legal counsel for over a decade, who had sat beside him during Daniel's memorial service, who had helped manage the company's affairs during the months when Richard could barely function. The betrayal was not the same shape as Victor's. Victor had been the architect. Grant had been something more cowardly and in some ways more dispiriting, a man who had looked directly at the edge of a wrong thing and chosen not to see it because seeing it would require him to act. "You helped him clean the record," Richard said. "Whatever you didn't know, you helped him make sure no one could find out what happened around my son's death." "Yes," Grant said, "and you have worked beside me for 5 years since." Grant closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Richard stood up. "The prosecutors will contact you," he said. "I suggest you call your own attorney tonight." Grant left. Richard stood at the window of his study for a long time after the sound of the car faded from the drive. He was not thinking about Victor or Grant specifically. He was thinking about the gap between the people who fill positions of trust and the actual quality of that trust. How it is possible to work beside someone for years, to share rooms and decisions and difficult moments, and to understand nothing essential about what they would do when the cost of integrity became real. Daniel had been 12 years old. He had had $12, and he had known without deliberating what the right thing to do was. Richard turned off the study light and went to bed. 3 weeks later, Victor Langford was extradited from Portugal. The process had moved faster than Richard's attorney had predicted, which meant the federal case was being treated with a seriousness that matched the weight of the evidence. Michael Grant surrendered voluntarily on the day his attorney negotiated the terms of his cooperation agreement. Both men faced charges that included corporate fraud, criminal conspiracy, and, in Victor's case, charges connected to the surveillance of a minor for purposes of coercion. Richard did not watch the news coverage. He had given a single formal statement through Patricia Osei's office and had said nothing publicly beyond it. The statement was measured and factual and ended with one sentence that was neither legal nor corporate in its language. "My son spent the last hours of his life helping a stranger, and he deserved to have the full truth of those hours known." On the morning after the arrests were confirmed, Richard drove to Clearwater Street. Lena opened the door before he knocked. The girls were at school. She had seen the news. He sat at her kitchen table, and she made tea, and they talked for a long time about things that had nothing to do with prosecutors or charges or corporate fraud. They talked about Daniel. She asked him questions she had been saving, what Daniel had been like as a younger child, whether he had always been the kind of boy who stopped for strangers, what his voice had sounded like. Richard answered everything. He talked about Daniel the way he had not talked about him since the early days of the grief, before the talking became too heavy to manage. He told her about the time Daniel was 9 years old and had given his winter coat to a classmate who came to school without one and then told no one, and Richard had only found out months later from another parent. He told her about the way Daniel used to leave encouraging notes in random places. He told her that Daniel had been a mediocre student in most subjects and an exceptional one in reading, and that he had wanted to be a marine biologist, which had surprised everyone who knew him because he had never shown any particular interest in the ocean until he was 11, and then had become briefly obsessed with it the way children become briefly obsessed with things. Lena laughed at the marine biology detail. It was a genuine laugh, warm and slightly surprised, and it changed the quality of the morning entirely. He sounds like someone I would have liked very much, she said. He would have liked you, Richard said. He would have thought you were someone worth knowing. She looked at him steadily. He already decided that, she said. The night he sat down. Richard nodded. When the girls came home from school that afternoon, he had stayed longer than he meant to. They came in and dropped their backpacks with the full-bodied relief of children for whom a backpack represents a genuine burden. And they stopped when they saw Richard at the table and then did not look particularly surprised, in the way of children who have decided someone belongs in a space and therefore expect to find them there. Amara sat down across from him and looked at him with the direct assessment that had characterized her from the first morning at the cemetery. Did you find out everything? She asked. Yes, Richard said. She nodded slowly. Good, she said. It had the finality of a verdict. Nia climbed onto the chair beside her mother and leaned against her arm and looked at Richard. Are you going to keep coming here? She asked. It was the kind of question only a child will ask directly, the kind that adults circle around for months or years while the answer quietly shapes itself without being spoken. Richard looked at both girls and at Lena, who was watching him with an expression that was open and careful at the same time. If that's all right, he said. It's all right, Nia said. She said it with the authority of someone closing a negotiation, which made Lena press her lips together in the way of a mother trying not to smile at an inappropriate moment. The Daniel Halstead Foundation was announced 6 weeks later. Richard had been planning it since the flight back from Portugal, turning the shape of it over during those sleepless hours above the Atlantic. He knew what it needed to be. Not a broad philanthropic vehicle, not a corporate foundation designed for tax efficiency and brand association. Something specific. Something that answered the particular thing Daniel had done on that particular night, scaled outward into a continuing practice. The foundation's mandate was direct. Emergency support for homeless families and young mothers in crisis, with a focus on women who had been displaced from their homes and were facing pregnancy or early parenthood without resources. Immediate practical help, shelter placement, food, legal assistance for housing disputes, financial support for the first year of stabilization. The kind of help that Lena had needed sitting on a bench in the rain, and that Daniel had provided in the only way a 12-year-old with $12 and a working phone could provide it. The announcement generated considerable press. Richard gave one interview to a journalist he had worked with before and trusted to be accurate. He told the full story, not the corporate fraud elements. Those were in the hands of the courts, but the human story. Daniel at the bus stop, Lena and the twins, the grave visits, the daisies. He told it plainly and without performance, in the same way he had always preferred to conduct the things that mattered. The response was larger than his communications team had predicted. Within the first week, the foundation received more in donations from the public than Richard had initially seeded it with himself. Letters arrived from people who had been helped by strangers and wanted to honor that. Letters arrived from people who were strangers to everyone in the story, but recognized something in it that belonged to them too. Lena became an advisor to the foundation's intake process. It had been her idea, offered quietly one afternoon when Richard was describing how the initial operations would be structured. She said she had specific knowledge about what women in that situation actually needed in the first 48 hours, knowledge that could not be learned from research or consultation with experts, and that she was willing to share it if he thought it would be useful. He thought it would be useful. She was, it turned out, extraordinarily good at it. She had a precision about the gaps in support systems and a directness about what worked and what felt performative that made the foundation's early operational decisions better than they would otherwise have been. She also had, as Richard observed over several months of working alongside her, a quality that he recognized from somewhere and could not immediately name until one afternoon it came to him clearly. She was like Daniel. Not in personality. She was quieter than Daniel had been, more measured, built from a different kind of experience, but in the essential orientation toward other people. The instinct to see the specific person in front of her rather than the category they represented. The refusal to reduce someone's situation to its most convenient summary. Daniel had recognized it in her the night he sat down. Richard understood. That was why he had stayed. 3 years passed. They were not painless years. The court proceedings were long and occasionally difficult. requiring Richard's attention and testimony at points that cost him considerably. Victor Langford received a federal sentence that his attorneys negotiated down from what the prosecutors initially sought, but that still represented a genuine consequence. Michael Grant cooperated fully and received a reduced sentence and a permanent bar from practicing law. Meridian Partners faced civil litigation that ultimately resulted in a settlement whose terms were not disclosed, but whose size, according to people who understood these things, was significant. Richard did not attend any of the sentencing hearings. He had given what he could give to the process, and he did not need to watch the endings. He already knew the endings. What he needed, and what he turned his attention toward in those years, was the thing that came after. The foundation grew. By the third year, it was operating in 11 cities, had helped over 4,000 families, and had a staff of 30 people who believed in what they were doing with a specificity of conviction that Richard had rarely encountered in the organizations he had built. He attended the quarterly reviews and the annual gatherings and occasionally showed up unannounced at regional offices in the way that he had always preferred, without notice, so that what he saw was real. Amara and Nia were 10 years old now. They had grown with the particular speed of children who seemed to cover years in weeks, and they had developed, as they grew, into people who were clearly distinct from each other in ways that had not been visible in the smaller versions. Amara was methodical and serious, with the quality of someone who makes decisions carefully and then holds to them. Nia was quicker and warmer, with an instinct for reading rooms that made adults underestimate her and then revise sharply upward. Both of them had Lena's directness and Daniel's ease with the idea that strangers were simply people you hadn't met the reason for yet. They had also, between them, developed a relationship with Richard that none of them had planned, and all of them had arrived at naturally. He came to Clearwater Street often enough that they stopped noting it as an event. He attended their school performances and their birthdays and the occasional weekend breakfast that Lena made when he appeared on a Saturday morning. He was not their grandfather in any technical or formal sense, and no one had applied that word to the arrangement. He was Richard, and that was a category they had created for him, and it fit. He was still grieving. He understood by now that he would always be grieving, that the grief was not a condition that resolved, but a presence that changed shape, that became over time less like drowning and more like carrying. Still heavy, still constant, but manageable in the way of things you have learned the proper grip for. But he was also something else now, something he had not been for the 5 years between Daniel's death and the mourning in the cemetery. He was present. He was connected to something that extended beyond his own loss. He was part of a story that was still being written, and the author of that story, the person whose choices had set it all in motion, was his son. On the Sunday morning 3 years after the arrests, Richard drove to Riverside Memorial Cemetery, as he had done every Sunday since Daniel died. The October air had come back around, the same amber and rust quality of leaves, the same cool that smelled of wet grass and approaching winter. He parked and walked through the iron gates and turned right at the stone angel with the chipped wing. 2 girls in bright coats walked beside him. Amara's coat was still red. Nia's was still yellow, a different yellow now, a brighter one. She had insisted on this specific shade when they bought it, and Lena had relented. Each of them carried flowers. Not grocery store daisies today, though daisies remained the foundation of it. They had added a few small white roses, which was Nia's addition, and a sprig of something green that Amara had selected from the florist with the focus of someone executing an important task. They walked without talking, the 3 of them, in the easy silence of people who have been enough places together that silence no longer requires filling. At Daniel's grave, the girls arranged the flowers with the careful attention they always gave this part. They knew exactly how they liked it. Amara placed the daisies first, fanned slightly to the left. Nia placed the roses in the center. The green sprig went on the right. They stood back and looked at it the way artists look at finished work, checking, adjusting slightly, deciding it was right. Then they knelt. Richard stood behind them and listened to the prayer they said, the same prayer they had always said, the words that had stopped him in his tracks the first morning he heard them. They said it the way they said everything, without self-consciousness, without performance, with the clean directness of people who mean exactly what they say. Thank you for saving our mom. The cemetery was very quiet. A bird somewhere in the oak trees above the gravel path. The distant sound of the city beyond the walls. The ordinary world going about its ordinary Sunday. Here at this stone in this quiet section, the three of them and the flowers in the October light. Richard stepped forward and crouched and placed his own hand against the headstone. The granite was cold from the morning air. He held his hand there for a moment. He did not say much. He never said much here. That had always been true, even in the years before he knew the full story. Even when he'd come alone and stood in silence for 20 or 30 minutes carrying the weight of everything he couldn't fix. He had never been a man who expressed the most important things in volume. He said, quietly, the thing he had come to say. You changed the world, son. He said it the way you say things to someone you're certain is listening. Not because you can explain the certainty, but because it is simply true in the way that some things are simply true prior to any argument about them. He stood up. The girls had risen and were standing beside him, one on each side. Nia slipped her hand into his without ceremony, the way she had always done since she was 7 years old, as if it were obvious, as if this were simply where her hand went. Amara stood with her arms folded, not in withdrawal, but in the particular posture of someone deeply satisfied with the state of things, which Richard had learned was her version of the same gesture. They walked back along the gravel path together, past the older headstones and the turning trees. The morning light was doing something particular as they reached the gates, breaking through a gap in the clouds above the cemetery and falling across the path ahead of them in a long, bright line, illuminating the gravel and the yellowed grass and the distance beyond the iron gates where the city waited. Richard paused at the gates and looked back. He could see Daniel's grave from here, the gray granite catching the same light, the small arrangement of flowers at its base visible even from this distance. White daisies, white roses, a sprig of green. The particular colors of an October morning in a place where someone had decided, years ago, to remember. He thought about what he had believed for 5 years. That Daniel's story was a story about loss. A boy taken too soon. A father left without the thing that had made the future make sense. That was the story Richard had been living, the story he had carried to this cemetery every Sunday for years, the story that had shaped the man he had become in the aftermath. But that was not the whole story. The whole story included Lena on a bench in the rain. It included 2 little girls in worn coats and the grocery store daisies they carried every year without fail. It included a foundation in 11 cities and 4,000 families and 30 people who came to work every day because they believed in what they were doing. It included this morning, this path, this light, these 2 hands, one in his, one folded with satisfaction at her side. Daniel's life had been 12 years long. But the kindness at the center of it had not stopped moving when Daniel did. It had kept traveling outward through the years in the way that kindness travels when it is genuine, not in a straight line, not with a clear destination, but steadily, the way light moves, touching things it was never aimed at and illuminating them anyway. Richard Halstead turned away from the cemetery and walked through the gates into the October morning with his son's girls on either side of him. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but it was no longer the only thing. If a child's single act of kindness could quietly reshape the lives of people he never got to meet, what does that say about the moments we choose to walk past?